Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful new adventure in the charming world of classic British mysteries. Settle in with a cup of tea as we return to the peaceful village of St. Mary, Mead, where nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. In this cozy tale, inspired by the timeless style of Agatha Christie, our beloved Miss Jane Marple once again uses her gentle wisdom and keen observation to unravel a puzzling enigma. Prepare for clever clues, charming characters, and a satisfying resolution in Miss Marple and the Silversmith's Tale. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Discovery at the Workshop. In the quiet English village of St. Mary, Mead, where thatched cottages huddled along winding lanes and the church spire rose gently above the elm trees. Life in the early 1950s proceeded with the unhurried rhythm of long habit. The war was over, rationing was easing, and the villagers had returned to their familiar pleasures. Morning walks along the hedgerows, afternoon teas in lace-curtained parlors, and the gentle exchange of news over garden fences. Nothing very dramatic ever seemed to happen in St. Mary Mead, and the inhabitants rather liked it that way. On the high street just past the post office and opposite the Blue Boar Inn stood a narrow bow-windowed shop that had been the silversmith's workshop for longer than anyone could remember. A discreet brass plate beside the door read R. Hargrove and Son, though the and Son had been something of a fiction for 40 years, ever since old Mr. Reginald Hargrove's only boy had died in the trenches in 1916. Inside, the air always carried the faint tang of metal polish and the soft glow of lamplight on silver. Trays, candlesticks, tea services, and delicate christening mugs gleamed in orderly rows behind the glass, each piece bearing the meticulous touch of the master craftsman. Reginald Hargrove himself was a tall, spare figure in his late 70s, with a neat white beard and shrewd gray eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles. He had lived alone above the workshop since his wife's death a decade earlier, rising early each morning to unlock the door at 9 sharp, polishing and engraving with the same patient precision he had shown for half a century. The villagers respected him. Some even liked him, though he was not a man for idle chatter. He had his opinions, firm ones, on modern workmanship, on the decline of standards, and on the proper way to restore a Georgian coffee pot. Miss Jane Marple, who lived in a neat little house with a pretty garden not 5 minutes' walk away, often passed the workshop on her daily constitutional. She was a slender, elderly lady with soft white hair, china blue eyes, and an air of gentle vagueness that deceived many into thinking her mind wandered. In fact, those mild eyes missed very little. She and Mr. Hargrove had developed a pleasant habit of nodding to one another, and occasionally he would invite her in to admire a particularly fine piece he was restoring. Miss Marple had a genuine appreciation for craftsmanship, and she enjoyed listening to him explain the difference between Sheffield plate and true sterling. It was a bright October morning with a nip in the air and the first fallen leaves skittering along the pavement when young Tommy Pierce, the post office errand boy, came hurtling down the high street as though pursued by demons. His freckled face was pale, his cap askew. "Mr. Hargrove's dead," he shouted as he burst into the constable's tiny office beside the village hall. "Lying there in the back room, dead as a doornail." Constable Polk, a solid mustached man who had policed St. Mary Mead for 20 years, and prided himself on knowing every inhabitant's business, rose heavily from his chair. "Now then, Tommy, calm yourself. What's all this?" "I went to deliver a parcel, registered it was, and the shop door was open like always, but no one came when I called. So I went through to the back workshop, and there he was, slumped over the bench. I touched his hand. It was cold. Oh, Mr. Polk, he's dead, I swear it." Within minutes, the news had spread like ripples in a pond. A small knot of villagers gathered outside the shop, murmuring in low, shocked voices. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, clutching her shopping basket, followed by the vicar's wife and Miss Hartnell in her tweeds. Someone fetched Dr. Haydock from his surgery at the other end of the village. Miss Marple, who had been purchasing wool at the draper's, heard the commotion and made her way quietly to the edge of the little crowd. She stood there, gloved hands resting on her umbrella, watching with that air of detached interest she so often wore. Constable Polk emerged from the shop and held up a hand. "Now then, let's not have any gawping. Dr. Haydock's with him now. Looks like natural causes. Heart, most likely. Poor old gentleman was getting on." Dr. Haydock appeared a few moments later, closing the door carefully behind him. He was a brusque, kindly man with a sharp intelligence that Miss Marple particularly respected. "Yes," he confirmed, addressing the constable, but loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Heart failure, nothing suspicious. He'd been looking a bit frail lately. I'll sign the certificate, no need for fuss." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring sympathy. Death came to everyone after all, and Mr. Hargrove had lived a long and respectable life. Yet Miss Marple lingered. Something, a very small thing, had caught her attention as she glimpsed the interior through the open door while the doctor was inside. The workshop was as tidy as ever. Tools laid out in perfect rows, a silver chalice half-polished beneath the green-shaded lamp. But on the floor beside the bench lay a soft yellow duster, crumpled as though dropped in haste. And there was an odor, very faint but unmistakable to anyone who had ever tended a garden or known someone fond of certain old-fashioned remedies. It was the smell of bitter almonds. Miss Marple stood quite still for a moment, her head slightly tilted. Then she turned and walked slowly homeward, her mind busy. That afternoon she sat in her small, sunny drawing room with her knitting, a pale blue shawl taking shape beneath her clicking needles, and thought about Mr. Hargrove. He had seemed in excellent spirits only the previous week, telling her proudly about a valuable commission. The restoration of a rare Georgian silver epergne for an important London collector. "Worth a pretty penny when it's finished, Miss Marple," he had said, his eyes gleaming. "And it'll bear my mark alongside the original makers. Not many can claim that." She recalled, too, that he had no close family. A niece in London visited occasionally, but relations were said to be cool. There were rumors about his will, whispers that the workshop and its contents would go to his young apprentice, Edgar Lawson, a sullen lad who had been with him 5 years. Or perhaps to charity. Village gossip was rarely precise, but it was seldom entirely wrong. By tea-time, the whole village knew that old Mr. Hargrove had died quietly at his bench, and most accepted Dr. Haydock's verdict without question. Yet as Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and cut a slice of seed cake, she found herself returning again and again to that faint Swedish odor and the crumpled duster on the floor. She had known cases, not in St. Mary Mead, of course, but elsewhere, where heart failure had been confidently diagnosed only for later investigation to reveal something rather different. Human nature, she reflected, was very much the same wherever one went, and in villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets were sometimes guarded all the more fiercely. Outside, the autumn sun slanted golden across the garden and the church clock struck 4. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her expression serene. But behind the mild blue eyes, her mind was already turning over possibilities gentle and inexorable as the tide. Chapter 2. The Suspects Emerge. The day following Mr. Hargrove's death dawned gray and drizzly, the sort of weather that kept most of St. Mary Mead indoors with curtains half drawn and kettles perpetually on the boil. By mid-morning, however, the news had settled into the comfortable shape of accepted fact. The old silversmith had died of heart failure at his workbench, a peaceful end for a man who had spent his life surrounded by beauty. An inquest was to be held that afternoon in the village hall, a brief formality everyone expected. Dr. Haydock would give his evidence, the coroner would express sympathy, and the matter would be closed. Yet even as the villagers prepared to attend out of respect, and it must be admitted curiosity, certain undercurrents of talk began to swirl. Miss Marple, having finished her breakfast of toast and marmalade, put on her neat gray coat and a felt hat secured with a pin, and set off for the high street. She told herself she merely wished to offer condolences at the workshop, but her steps were purposeful. The shop door stood ajar, a black crepe ribbon tied to the knocker. Inside, young Edgar Lawson, Mr. Hargrove's apprentice, was sweeping the floor with rather unnecessary vigor. He was a thin, dark-haired young man of perhaps 25 with a narrow face and restless eyes. His manners were usually surly, though he could turn on a certain oily politeness when it suited him. "Good morning, Edgar," Miss Marple said gently, pausing on the threshold. "Such a sad loss. You must feel it deeply after working together so long." Edgar leaned on his broom, wiping his forehead with the back of a hand that trembled slightly. "Yes, miss. Terrible shock it was. Found him myself nearly. Tommy Pierce got there first, but I came in minutes later. Slumped over the bench just like that." Miss Marple stepped inside, her glance moving quietly about the familiar room. Everything was in its place, the silver gleaming softly in the muted light. The chalice Mr. Hargrove had been polishing still stood beneath the lamp, now covered with a clean cloth. "You were not here when it happened?" she asked. "No, miss. I'd gone out early to deliver a christening mug to Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. Got there just after 9:30 and stayed for a cup of tea in the kitchen. Cook will tell you. When I got back, the constable was already here." Miss Marple nodded. "A mercy, perhaps, that you were spared finding him. And now, what will become of the business?" Edgar's expression tightened. "That's for the solicitor to say. Mr. Hargrove always told me the workshop would be mine one day, tools and all. I've been with him 5 years, learned everything from him. It's only right." There was a note of defiance in his voice that interested Miss Marple very much. Outside in the street, she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, a formidable lady in a fur-trimmed coat who served on every village committee. "Dreadful about poor Mr. Hargrove," Mrs. Price Ridley declared. "Though between ourselves, my dear, I'm not entirely surprised. His niece, that Miss Prentice from London, was here only last week, and they had the most fearful row. I happened to be passing the shop and heard raised voices, something about money he'd lent her years ago and refused to forget. She went off on the Tuesday train in a fine temper." Miss Marple murmured sympathy. Evelyn Prentice was a name she knew slightly, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, always impeccably dressed, who visited her uncle once or twice a year and never stayed long. By the time the inquest opened at 2 o'clock, the little hall was comfortably full. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence with crisp assurance. Mr. Hargrove had suffered from a weak heart for some years. Death had been instantaneous and entirely natural. The coroner expressed the expected regret and brought in the expected verdict. Yet afterwards, in the drizzle outside, Inspector Slack from the county police could be seen in earnest conversation with Constable Polk. Inspector Slack was a large, energetic man who believed in thoroughness and disliked loose ends. He had been sent merely to oversee formalities, but something, perhaps Dr. Haydock's private mention of that faint almond odor, had piqued his interest. Over the next few days, as the village prepared for the funeral, 4 names began to appear more and more frequently in quiet conversations. First, of course, was Edgar Lawson, the apprentice who expected to inherit the business and whose alibi rested on a visit to Gossington Hall. Second was Miss Evelyn Prentice, the niece who had quarreled bitterly over money and departed only 2 days before the death. Third was Captain Arthur Blaine, a retired Army officer who had moved to St. Mary Mead 3 years earlier, and was known as a keen collector of antique silver. He had sold Mr. Hargrove a handsome George III salver only a month ago, and word had got about, through the postman who had sharp ears, that Hargrove suspected the hallmarks had been cleverly altered. A forgery, in fact. The captain had been heard protesting loudly in the shop the very afternoon before the death. The fourth was Mrs. Lydia Dane, Hargrove's cleaning woman, a thin, anxious widow who came twice a week and was devoted to her invalid son. She had been heard complaining in the post office that the old man owed her 3 weeks' wages and was too mean to part with a shilling. Money again, always a powerful motive. Miss Marple attended the funeral on a blustery Friday, standing respectfully among the mourners as Mr. Hargrove was laid to rest in the churchyard beside his wife. Afterwards, at the vicarage where the vicar's wife had laid on tea and sandwiches, she listened carefully to the talk that flowed around her. Captain Blaine, tall and soldierly with a neatly trimmed mustache, accepted a cup of tea and spoke feelingly of Hargrove's skill. "A tragedy to lose such a craftsman," he said. "We had our differences, mere quibbles over a piece I sold him, but nothing serious." Mrs. Dane, in a black hat that had seen better days, dabbed her eyes and told anyone who would listen how kind the old gentleman had sometimes been, slipping her an extra half-crown now and then. Edgar Lawson kept to himself near the door, looking pale and interesting. Only Evelyn Prentice was absent. A telegram had arrived expressing regret that pressing business kept her in London. As Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard, pausing to read a familiar inscription or two, she reflected on how very convenient natural death could sometimes appear. Heart failure was so obligingly vague, and yet that faint, persistent memory of bitter almonds lingered in her mind like a discord in an otherwise harmonious melody. She had known cases, oh yes, several, where what seemed the most natural demise in the world had proved, upon gentle inquiry, to be nothing of the sort. Back in her drawing room, with the gas fire hissing softly and her knitting needles clicking once more, Miss Marple reviewed the 4 names in her mind. 4 people, each with a possible reason to wish Mr. Hargrove out of the way. 4 alibis that might or might not bear examination. Outside, the rain pattered against the windows, and the village settled into its evening quiet. But in the neat little house with the pretty garden, a quiet, relentless mind was already beginning to turn over the small, seemingly insignificant details that so often held the key to truth. Chapter 3. Initial Clues in Conversations. The funeral was scarcely over before the drizzle turned to steady rain, drumming on the slate roofs of St. Mary Mead, and sending everyone hurrying home with umbrellas blooming like black mushrooms along the lanes. Miss Marple, sheltered beneath a sensible navy one, paused at the lich gate to exchange a few words with Dr. Haydock, who was folding his large frame into a damp mackintosh. "A sad business," the doctor said, shaking his head, "though I suppose we should be thankful it was quick. Poor Hargrove didn't suffer." Miss Marple looked up at him with her mild, bird-like gaze. "You are quite certain it was the heart, doctor?" Haydock hesitated the merest fraction. "As certain as one can be without a post-mortem, which the coroner saw no need for. The symptoms were classic. Sudden collapse, no signs of violence, and he had been complaining of palpitations now and then." "Yet there was that faint odor," Miss Marple murmured almost to herself, "rather like bitter almonds." The doctor shot her a quick glance. "You noticed it too?" "I thought I caught a whiff, but it was so slight I put it down to some cleaning fluid. Hargrove used all sorts of old-fashioned mixtures for brightening silver. Some of them have a peculiar smell." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I remember a case in which a very similar smell proved to be significant." Haydock gave a short laugh. "You and your cases, Miss Marple. Still, if it will ease your mind, I've kept a sample for analysis, just routine precaution." Results won't be back for a few days. She thanked him gravely and continued on her way, her mind turning over the conversation like a smooth pebble in her pocket. That same afternoon, feeling the need for a little gentle exercise and perhaps a little gentle conversation, Miss Marple decided to call upon her old friend Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. The hall lay a pleasant 20-minute walk from the village along a lane bordered by dripping beech trees. Dolly Bantry, a large, good-natured woman with untidy gray hair and a fondness for gossip, welcomed her with delight. "My dear Jane, come in out of this dreadful wet. You'll have a cup of tea and tell me all the news. We've heard nothing but Hargrove, Hargrove, Hargrove for days." The drawing-room at Gossington Hall was comfortably shabby, with faded chintz covers and a log fire crackling in the grate. Over scones and blackberry jam, Mrs. Bantry launched into a lively account of Edgar Lawson's visit on the fatal morning. He arrived at 9:30 with the christening mug I'd ordered for my goddaughter. Such a pretty thing, roses and forget-me-nots engraved round the rim. He stayed for a cup of tea in the kitchen. Cook was quite taken with his manners that day. Said he seemed ever so cheerful, talking about taking over the business soon. Then he left about 10:15, I suppose. Plenty of time to get back to the village before poor Mr. Hargrove was found. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And you are sure of the time?" "Oh, yes. I'd just come in from the garden when he arrived, and the clock in the hall was striking the half-hour. Arthur, Colonel Bantry, you know, was reading the paper and grumbled that the boy was late." "And Miss Prentice?" Miss Marple inquired. "Did you happen to see her before she left for London?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes bright. "Only from a distance. She caught the Tuesday morning train, 11:15, the one that stops at Much Benham. I was in the post office when she bought her ticket. Looked thoroughly put out, I thought." Mrs. Price Ridley swears she heard her say to her uncle, "You'll be sorry for this one day," or something of the sort. Money, of course. Evelyn always was short of it. Miss Marple nodded. Family quarrels are so distressing, though one does wonder why she needed quite so much. "Bridge debts, if you ask me," Mrs. Bantry said darkly. "London habits are expensive." When Miss Marple left Gossington Hall an hour later, the rain had eased to a soft mist. Instead of returning directly home, she took a slight detour that brought her past the silversmith's workshop. The door was closed now, a notice in the window announcing that it would remain shut until further notice. But as she lingered a moment, adjusting her scarf, the door opened and Edgar Lawson appeared, locking up behind him. "Good afternoon, Edgar," she said pleasantly. "I hope you are managing." He started slightly, then touched his cap. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. It's hard, right enough. So much to see to. Papers, stock, the solicitor coming tomorrow. You will miss him greatly, I expect." Edgar's face took on a doleful expression. "Like a father he was to me. Taught me everything I know, and now—" His voice trailed away. Miss Marple glanced at the bow window. Such beautiful pieces he made. That chalice on the bench. Was that the one he was working on when— "Yes, miss, a special commission. Nearly finished it was. I've left it just as he had it." "May I see it?" I always admired his polishing. Technique. After a moment's hesitation, Edgar unlocked the door again and led her inside. The workshop smelled faintly of metal and beeswax. The chalice stood uncovered now, its bowl gleaming softly under the lamp. Beside it lay the tools in their precise rows, and on a shelf a bottle labeled Silver Brightener. Use sparingly. Miss Marple bent to examine the chalice, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. The metal was flawless, the chasing exquisite. But in the saucer beneath it she noticed a few grains of a pale, crystalline substance that had not been there before, or perhaps had been overlooked in the first confusion. Such delicate work, she murmured. And this brightener, he mixed it himself? Edgar nodded. An old recipe of his. Very effective but strong. He kept the ingredients locked in the cupboard. Miss Marple's glance strayed to the small cupboard in the corner. The key was in the lock. Curious, she said softly. I thought Mr. Hargrove was always most particular about locking up his special materials. Edgar flushed. He was. I expect he forgot that morning being taken ill so sudden. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. She thanked him and took her leave, walking homeward at a gentle pace. The mist was lifting and pale sunlight touched the wet roofs of the village. In her mind, she reviewed the small things she had noticed. The grains in the saucer, the unlocked cupboard, Edgar's momentary unease. Back in her drawing room, with the kettle singing and her knitting resumed, Miss Marple allowed herself a tiny sigh. Human nature was so very transparent once one knew where to look. Greed, fear, ambition, they wore different faces, but the features were always recognizable. And somewhere among the quiet houses of St. Mary Mead, she felt certain someone was relying far too heavily on the convenient verdict of heart failure. Outside, the church clock struck 5, its notes floating clear across the damp air. Miss Marple poured her tea, added a careful spoonful of sugar, and began to plan her next few gentle inquiries. Chapter 4. A red herring surfaces. A week after the funeral, St. Mary Mead had begun to settle back into its usual placid routine. The black crepe ribbon had been removed from the silversmith's door, though the shop remained closed while the solicitor sorted out Mr. Hargrove's affairs. The rain had cleared, leaving crisp autumn days perfect for walking, and the village women were busy with plans for the upcoming church bazaar. Miss Marple, however, found her thoughts returning persistently to the workshop. She had taken to passing it each morning on her way to the post office, pausing just long enough to glance at the undisturbed window display. The silver pieces still gleamed invitingly, but a faint film of dust was beginning to dull their luster. One bright morning she encountered Inspector Slack outside the Blue Boar. He was standing with Constable Polk, looking rather pleased with himself, his large face red from the exertion of cycling from much Benham. "Good morning, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "I trust you are enjoying our village air." Slack touched his hat briskly. "Morning, ma'am. Air's all right, but I've been busy. Looks as though there might be more to this Hargrove business than met the eye." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Indeed. I am glad to hear it." The inspector lowered his voice, though there was no one near. "Those samples Dr. Haydock sent off. Preliminary report came back yesterday, traces of cyanide. Not enough to be certain yet, but enough to make me sit up. We're treating it as suspicious now." Constable Polk nodded importantly. "Murder, that's what it is. Poison, deliberate." Miss Marple received the news without visible surprise. "Cyanide," she repeated softly. "That would account for the almond odor. Poor Mr. Hargrove." Slack eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. "You noticed the smell too, did you? Sharp senses you've got, Miss Marple. Well, we're investigating properly now, and we've got a prime suspect." He paused for effect. "Captain Blaine." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Captain Blaine? The collector?" "That's the one. Turns out he sold Hargrove a George III salver last month. Supposed to be worth a packet, Hargrove had started to suspect the hallmarks were faked. Clever job, but not quite clever enough for a man who'd spent his life studying silver. The old boy was threatening to go to the police, expose the whole thing. That would have ruined Blaine. His reputation as a connoisseur, everything. "And did Captain Blaine know that Mr. Hargrove suspected?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, yes. The postman heard them at it the very afternoon before Hargrove died. Blaine was in the shop, voice raised, saying it was all a mistake, that he'd bought the piece in good faith. Hargrove wasn't having any of it. Told him straight, "I've a mind to report this to the authorities, Captain." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A serious matter, certainly. Forgery of hallmarks is a criminal offense." "Exactly," said Slack triumphantly. "Motive as clear as daylight. And opportunity. Blaine lives just round the corner from the workshop. Could have slipped in any time." That same afternoon, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Bazaar Committee in the vicarage drawing room. Captain Blaine was there, looking rather strained beneath his military bearing. He was in charge of the White Elephant stall and was busy sorting donations. When the meeting ended and the ladies were gathering up their handbags, Miss Marple lingered to admire a rather ugly vase that had been contributed. "Such an interesting piece," she said to the captain. "One wonders about its history." Blaine gave a short laugh. "Probably none at all, just modern rubbish like that wretched salver I sold poor Hargrove. I feel dreadful about the whole thing." Miss Marple looked sympathetic. "A misunderstanding, perhaps. More than that, I'm afraid. The hallmarks were tampered with. Someone did a clever job before it ever came to me, but Hargrove thought I'd known. We had words. I told him I'd make it right, refund every penny, but he was adamant about reporting it." Blaine's mustache drooped. "And now he's dead. People will think—" He left the sentence unfinished. Miss Marple murmured something soothing and took her leave. Over the next few days, Inspector Slack pursued his theory with energy. He interviewed Captain Blaine at length, searched his house, with permission, for the captain was anxious to clear his name, and even discovered a small tin of cyanide crystals in the garden shed. "For killing wasps' nests," Blaine explained, his face crimson. "I've had it for years." Slack was not convinced. The tin was brought forward as evidence, and the captain's arrest seemed imminent. Meanwhile, another small matter surfaced that added to the general atmosphere of suspicion. Mrs. Lydia Dane, the cleaning woman, appeared at the police station in a state of great distress, clutching a tiny silver salt spoon. "I took it," she confessed tearfully to Constable Polk. "Just temporary like. My boy's birthday was coming and I wanted to give him something pretty to look at. I meant to put it back next time I cleaned. But now with Mr. Hargrove gone, I couldn't sleep for worrying." The spoon was identified as part of a set from the workshop display. Mrs. Dane returned it and was cautioned, but the incident fed the growing whisper that Hargrove had been surrounded by people with reason to wish him ill. Miss Marple heard about the spoon from Miss Hartnell, who had been in the post office when Mrs. Dane emerged, still weeping. "Petty theft," Miss Hartnell said briskly. "Though one can't help feeling sorry for the poor woman. That invalid boy of hers costs a fortune in medicine." Miss Marple agreed that it was sad, but her mind was elsewhere. She paid a quiet call on Mrs. Dane the following day, taking a small jar of calf's foot jelly as a pretext. The cottage was small and scrupulously clean. Mrs. Dane, pale and red-eyed, accepted the jelly with thanks. "Such a trying time for you," Miss Marple said gently. "First Mr. Hargrove's death, and now this unfortunate business of the spoon." Mrs. Dane twisted her apron. "I never stole in my life before, miss, but my boy, he does so love pretty things. And Mr. Hargrove owed me wages. 3 weeks, I believe." "Yes, miss. He was always slow paying, said cash was tight. But after he died, I thought maybe the money would never come, and I got desperate." Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Dane's hands, though rough from work, were clean and free from any trace of polish or chemical stains. On her way home, Miss Marple paused again outside the silent workshop. The red herring, if that is what Captain Blaine proved to be, was swimming strongly. Yet something about it failed to satisfy her. Cyanide in the garden shed was convenient, certainly. But cyanide and silver polish was even more convenient if one knew where to find it. And Captain Blaine, for all his bluster, was not a man who struck her as subtle enough for poison. No, she thought as she resumed her walk. The truth lay rather closer to the workbench itself. That evening, sitting by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reviewed the facts. A poison that smelled of almonds, a bottle of special brightener, a locked cupboard left unlocked, an apprentice who expected to inherit, and a collector whose reputation hung by a thread. Human nature, she reflected, was seldom as straightforward as the police liked to believe. And red herrings, however tempting, had a habit of leading one away from the true scent. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the leaves in the garden, and the church clock struck 7. Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of elderberry wine and settled down to think. Chapter 5. Deepening Shadows. The news that Captain Blaine had been taken in for further questioning spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of a summer grass fire. By lunchtime the following day, every shop and cottage buzzed with it. Mrs. Price Ridley declared over the counter at the grocer's that she had always thought there was something not quite about retired army men who collected silver, while Miss Hartnell announced firmly that cyanide in a shed was proof positive of guilt. Miss Marple, purchasing a quarter-pound of tea and a small packet of arrowroot biscuits, listened to the chatter with her usual mild attention. She made no comment, but when she stepped out into the high street, the faint pucker between her brows betrayed that her thoughts were busy. That afternoon she paid a call on Dr. Haydock at his surgery. He was between patients and welcomed her into his consulting room with a wry smile. "Well, Miss Marple, you've heard the latest excitement. Slack is convinced he's got his man. Blaine's been at the station since 10 o'clock answering questions." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite his desk. "And what do you think, Doctor?" Haydock leaned back, fingers drumming on the blotter. "I think Slack is jumping the gun. The cyanide traces in Hargrove were definite. Prussic acid, no doubt about it now, but the quantity was small. Enough to kill quickly, especially in a man with a weak heart, but not the sort of massive dose you'd get from garden crystals. More like something ingested gradually or in solution." "In the polishing compound, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested softly. Haydock's eyes sharpened. "Exactly what I've been wondering. Some old silver brightening recipes used potassium cyanide. Dangerous stuff, but effective for removing tarnish. Hargrove was known to keep a special mixture locked away. If someone added a little extra to that—" He left the sentence hanging. Miss Marple nodded. "And the cupboard was found unlocked on the morning he died." "Precisely. Slack's focusing on Blaine because the forgery row gives him a nice, clear motive, and the cyanide in the shed ties it up neatly. But Blaine's no chemist. He wouldn't know how to introduce poison into a polishing paste without leaving obvious signs. And why would he? A man in a panic over exposure would be more likely to use a hammer than subtle poison." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite. Captain Blaine strikes one as a direct sort of person." She rose to go, then paused. "The full toxicology report. When will it be ready? Tomorrow or the day after? I've asked for a detailed analysis of stomach contents and any residues on the workbench." "Thank you, Doctor. You are always so thorough." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a piece of plain knitting, a warm scarf for the church sale, and reviewed what she knew. Cyanide and a special brightener kept locked, a key either forgotten or deliberately left, an apprentice who knew every detail of the craft, a niece desperate for money, a cleaning woman short of wages, a collector facing disgrace, 4 suspects, each with access of a kind. She decided upon a little experiment of her own. The next morning, bright and frosty, she visited the workshop again. Edgar Lawson had reopened the shop. a tentative notice in the window announcing that repairs and commissions would be accepted as usual. He was behind the counter polishing a small tray when she entered, the familiar tang of metal in the air. "Good morning, Edgar. How sensible of you to carry on. Mr. Hargrove would have wished it." Edgar managed a thin smile. "Have to earn a living, miss. Solicitor says I can keep things going till the will's proved." Miss Marple admired a pretty Victorian sugar basin in the window. "Such lovely work. And the chalice, the one your master was restoring, is it finished?" "Nearly. Just wants the final burnish." He hesitated. "Would you like to see it?" She followed him into the back room. The workbench was much as it had been, though tidier now. The chalice stood gleaming, complete. Beside it, the bottle of brightener, half empty. Edgar picked up a soft cloth. "I've been using his own mixture. Works a treat." Miss Marple watched with interest as he applied a little of the paste and began to rub. There was no trace of almond odor. "May I?" she asked, extending a gloved hand. Edgar gave her the cloth. She dabbed delicately at the silver, then lifted it to her nose. Nothing but the usual faint chemical smell. She handed it back with a smile. "Beautifully done. You have his touch." As she left, her mind noted two things. The brightener now in use was harmless, and Edgar had been careful to show her that it was harmless. Later that day, a new ripple disturbed the village calm. Miss Evelyn Prentice arrived unexpectedly on the afternoon train. She took a room at the Blue Boar and was seen walking to the workshop, where she remained in conversation with Edgar for nearly an hour. Village tongues wagged afresh. Mrs. Price Ridley, encountering Miss Marple in the library, could not resist. "Mark my words, Jane, that woman's come back because she feels guilty. Quarreling over money one day and the next her uncle's dead. Very convenient for her if he'd changed his will." Miss Marple selected a volume of gardening essays and murmured, "We do not yet know the terms of the will." "Exactly. And now she's here, probably trying to make sure young Edgar doesn't get everything. I saw them through the window, heads together like conspirators." In the evening, Inspector Slack released Captain Blaine with stiff apologies. No charge would be brought. The cyanide in his shed was indeed old and intended for pests, and his alibi for the crucial hour, breakfast with the vicar, was cast iron. Blaine was furious, his military mustache bristling, and declared loudly in the Blue Boar that he would never forgive the police their insinuations. Slack, undeterred, turned his attention elsewhere. That same evening he called at Mrs. Dane's cottage and questioned her closely about her movements and her grievances over unpaid wages. Mrs. Dane emerged pale and trembling, telling her neighbor that the inspector had practically accused her of poisoning the old man for the sake of a few pounds. By nightfall, the village was divided into camps, those who still believed Blaine guilty despite his release, those who now suspected the London niece, those who pitied Mrs. Dane, and those, like the postman, who were convinced Edgar had done it for the business. Miss Marple, taking her hot milk at bedtime, reflected that confusion was often the murderer's best friend. With so many motives and opportunities scattered about, the truth became harder to discern. Yet certain small facts remained clear in her mind. The unlocked cupboard, the faint almond smell that had vanished, the grains in the saucer, the brightener now safe. She had known a case once, a nurse in a hospital who had used digitalis with great subtlety, and another where a jealous secretary had tampered with her employer's tonic. Poisoners were often those closest to the victim, those who understood daily habits. As the church clock struck 11 and the village sank into silence, Miss Marple turned off her bedside lamp. Somewhere in the pattern of ordinary lives, she felt sure the fatal thread was waiting to be found. She fell asleep peacefully, her dreams undisturbed, for she knew that patience and observation would, in time, reveal everything. Chapter 6. false trails, and observations. With Captain Blaine cleared and the village still humming from the drama, Inspector Slack turned his formidable energy toward the remaining suspects like a terrier worrying a bone. He began with Evelyn Prentice, summoning her to the constable's office for a formal interview the very morning after her arrival. Miss Marple, happening to pass the village hall on an errand to the library, noticed the London niece emerging some 40 minutes later. Miss Prentice's face was flushed, her smart hat slightly askew, and she walked with the brisk, angry stride of someone who has been unjustly accused. That evening, over a cup of cocoa in her drawing room, Miss Marple received a full account from Mrs. Bantry, who had it direct from the constable's wife. Slack all but accused her outright, Mrs. Bantry reported with relish, settling her ample form into the most comfortable chair. Kept asking why she'd come back so suddenly and whether she'd handled any of the bottles or jars in the workshop during her visit. Poor woman denied it hotly. Said she'd never gone further than the front shop and certainly never touched Uncle's nasty chemicals. Then he brought up the quarrel about money and suggested she might have added something to his tea when she called the day before she left. Miss Marple poured a second cup. And her reply? Said if she'd wanted to poison him, she'd hardly have chosen a method that might be discovered, and anyway, she'd left for London 2 full days earlier. Her landlady in town confirmed she was home by tea-time Tuesday. Slack couldn't shake her on that. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward confidentially. But here's the interesting part, Jane. Apparently, Slack found out that Evelyn had been back to the village briefly on the Wednesday evening, only for half an hour, to collect a book she'd left behind. No one saw her, but the station porter remembers selling her a return ticket. She admits it now, says she slipped in quietly because she didn't want another scene with her uncle. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Half an hour would be time enough if one knew exactly what to do. Exactly what Slack said, though Evelyn swears she never went near the workshop. Just collected the book from the digs she'd been staying in and caught the next train back. Mrs. Bantry sighed. It doesn't look good, does it? Miss Marple murmured something non-committal and changed the subject to the church bazaar. The following day, Inspector Slack turned his attention to Mrs. Lydia Dane. He arrived at her cottage with Constable Polk in tow and questioned her for over an hour about her cleaning days, her knowledge of the workshop, and whether she had ever seen the special brightener. Mrs. Dane, already nervous from the business of the stolen spoon, became almost incoherent with fright. She admitted freely that she had often seen Mr. Hargrove mix his polish, and that the cyanide ingredient, he'd called it the strong stuff, was kept in a small locked cupboard. She insisted she had no key and had never touched it. But you could have taken an impression, Slack suggested heavily, or found the key when he wasn't looking. At this, Mrs. Dane burst into tears, declaring that she might be poor, but she wasn't a murderer, and all she'd ever wanted was her rightful wages. The inspector left unsatisfied, but with no real evidence against her. Meanwhile, Edgar Lawson continued quietly at the workbench, accepting a few small repairs from villagers who felt sorry for him. He presented a picture of dignified mourning, pale, respectful, ready to speak feelingly of his late master's skill whenever anyone entered the shop. Miss Marple paid him another visit under pretense of inquiring about having a silver frame cleaned. She found him engraving a small plaque, his movements precise and confident. "You have a steady hand, Edgar," she observed. "Your master taught you well." He flushed with pleasure. "I hope I'll do him credit, miss. Once the will's settled and the place is officially mine, I mean to keep up his standards." Miss Marple glanced around the familiar room. Such a responsibility for a young man. And yet you seem very sure it will come to you. Edgar's expression clouded briefly. He often said it would. No other family bar Miss Prentice, and they weren't close. Besides, who else would he leave it to? I've been like a son to him these 5 years. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Though I believe Miss Prentice expected something, a legacy perhaps. Edgar gave a short, humorless laugh. She expected the earth from what I heard, always borrowing and never paying back. But Mr. Hargrove had had enough of that. She watched him closely as he worked. His hands were stained faintly from the engraving acid, but clean of any polish residue. A careful young man, she thought. That same afternoon, she took tea with the vicar's wife and listened to the latest gossip. It seemed Mrs. Dane had been heard saying in the post office queue that some people would do anything for money and the police ought to look closer to home. The remark was generally taken to refer to Evelyn Prentice. Captain Blaine, still smarting from his ordeal, had withdrawn somewhat from village society and was rarely seen outside his own garden gate. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind sifting the various threads. So many motives floated on the surface: greed for an inheritance, fear of exposure, resentment over money owed or withheld, and yet none quite fitted perfectly. She thought of the cyanide, introduced not clumsily but with knowledge and precision. Someone who understood silver polishing, who knew exactly how much strong stuff would kill without leaving an obvious mess. Someone who had access to the locked cupboard and could replace or alter the contents unnoticed. Edgar knew the craft intimately. Evelyn might have learned something on her visits, though it seemed unlikely. Mrs. Dane had watched the process often, enough to imitate it. Even Captain Blaine, as a collector, might have picked up the information from books or conversation. But subtlety pointed away from the captain's bluster and away from Mrs. Dane's timid desperation. She recalled a case she had once heard of. A young man in a chemist's shop who had gradually increased the dose of a dangerous drug until the fatal moment arrived. Patience and familiarity had been his weapons. Back in her cottage, as dusk gathered and she drew the curtains against the chill, Miss Marple took out her knitting and settled by the fire. The pattern was becoming clearer, though certain pieces still eluded her. The almond smell had been present on the fatal morning, yet absent when she later tested the brightener. That suggested the poison had been added for that one occasion only, either to the mixture actually used or perhaps to the cloth itself. A cloth that had been crumpled on the floor and later tidied away. She thought of alibis. Edgar's had seemed solid, delivery to Gossington Hall at 9:30, when death had occurred sometime before Tommy Pierce's arrival at 11. Yet the doctor had estimated the time of death as between 8 and 10. Plenty of margin. Evelyn's brief secret return on the Wednesday gave opportunity but little time for careful preparation. Mrs. Dane had cleaned on Thursdays. The death was on a Friday. Small discrepancies, but persistent. Outside, the church clock struck 6, its notes mellow in the frosty air. Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of milk, added a pinch of nutmeg, and continued her knitting. False trails abounded, and the police were still stumbling along them. But she felt the truth drawing nearer, like a shape emerging from autumn mist. Patience, she reminded herself, was the detective's greatest virtue, and observation of the small, everyday things that others overlooked. The answer, she was certain, lay not in dramatic quarrels or obvious greed, but in something quieter, more calculating. Chapter 7. A crucial discovery. The frost had hardened into a thin, crisp blanket over St. Mary Mead, and the village gardens sparkled in the weak December sunlight as though dusted with powdered glass. Smoke rose straight and blue from cottage chimneys, and the air carried the faint, comforting scent of wood fires. Most inhabitants were busy with early Christmas preparations, writing cards, baking mince pies, rehearsing for the carol service. But the shadow of Mr. Hargrove's death still lingered in conversations. Miss Marple, wrapped in a warm woolen coat and a soft blue scarf she had knitted herself, took her usual morning walk. She passed the silversmith's workshop, noted that the curtains were drawn across the back room, and continued down the lane that ran behind the high street. It was a narrow path bordered by hedges and the backs of gardens, seldom used except by tradesmen and those taking shortcuts. As she walked, her eyes, as always, moved gently over her surroundings. Nothing escaped her: the fresh wheel marks of the milk float, the paw prints of a cat across a flower bed, the small heap of garden rubbish awaiting collection outside Captain Blaine's gate. It was at the corner where the lane curved behind the workshop that she noticed something half buried among fallen leaves. A soft yellow polishing cloth, crumpled and discarded as though tossed away in haste. She bent stiffly, supporting herself with her umbrella, and picked it up with gloved fingers. The cloth was stained in patches with the familiar pale residue of silver polish. But there was something more, a faint, lingering trace of that sweetish, almond-like odor she remembered so well. She folded the cloth carefully into a clean handkerchief and slipped it into her handbag. Continuing her walk, she reflected on the find. The lane was overlooked by the small window of the workshop's back room. Anyone leaving hurriedly might have thrown the cloth there to be rid of it, intending to retrieve it later, or trusting that no one would notice. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid the cloth on her dressing table and examined it more closely in the light from the window. The stains were uneven, heavier in the center, and there were one or two tiny crystalline grains adhering to the fibers. She placed these carefully in a small envelope, labeling it neatly in her precise handwriting. That afternoon she carried both cloth and envelope to Dr. Haydock, encountering him just as he was leaving for his rounds. "I wonder, Doctor, if you would be so kind as to have these analyzed with the other samples," she said mildly. "I found them in the lane behind the workshop. They may be of interest." Haydock took the parcels, his eyebrows rising. "Another of your discoveries, Miss Marple? You have a positive genius for turning up significant trifles." She smiled. "One notices things, that is all." The following day brought an even more intriguing development. The solicitor from Much Benham, a dry, precise little man named Mr. Pender, arrived to read Mr. Hargrove's will to the interested parties. The reading took place in the front parlor of the Blue Boar, with Edgar Lawson, Evelyn Prentice, and, to general surprise, Captain Blaine, all present. Mrs. Dane had been sent a letter but did not attend. Mr. Pender adjusted his spectacles and began. The will was recent, made only 3 months earlier. Small legacies went to the Church Restoration Fund and to Mrs. Dane in full settlement of any wages due. Captain Blaine received a handsome silver inkstand in appreciation of many pleasant discussions on the craft. Evelyn Prentice was left her late mother's jewelry, which had been in her uncle's keeping. The bulk of the estate, the workshop, tools, stock, and a not inconsiderable sum in savings was left not to Edgar Lawson but to a London firm of silversmiths, with the expressed wish that they continue the business and employ Edgar as manager at a generous salary for 5 years, after which he might purchase the concern at a favorable price. Edgar's face, as the terms were read, turned first red and then very pale. Evelyn Prentice gave a small, involuntary exclamation of surprise. Captain Blaine merely looked thoughtful. When the reading ended, Edgar rose abruptly and left the room without a word. Evelyn followed a moment later, her expression unreadable. News of the will traveled through the village within hours. Sympathy swung toward Edgar, deprived, after all, of what he had believed would be his outright. Suspicion, however, swung with it. If Edgar had learned the terms of the new will before Mr. Hargrove's death. Miss Marple heard the details from Mrs. Bantry over tea that same afternoon. "Poor young man," Mrs. Bantry said, passing the cake. He looked absolutely thunderstruck, and now everyone's saying he must have found out somehow and decided to act before it was too late. Miss Marple accepted a slice of Madeira cake. It is certainly a stronger motive than we had supposed. But how could he have known? The will was locked in the solicitor's office. Mr. Hargrove may have told him, Miss Marple suggested, or shown him a draft. Or perhaps Edgar saw something, a letter, a note, that gave him the truth. Mrs. Bantry nodded sagely. And then poisoned the old man to stop the new will taking effect. It's dreadful, but it makes sense. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She was thinking of the polishing cloth now in Dr. Haydock's hands and of another small discovery she had made that morning. While walking past the workshop again, she had noticed that the chalice, the valuable piece Mr. Hargrove had been restoring, was no longer on the workbench visible through the window. Instead, a lesser piece occupied its place. On impulse, she had entered the shop. Edgar was not there. A notice said, "Back in 10 minutes." The back room door stood ajar. Glancing in, she saw the chalice on a side table, its base unscrewed and a small cavity revealed. Inside lay not silver, but a collection of tiny tools, fine files, punches, acids, clearly intended for altering hallmarks. Mr. Hargrove himself had been quietly forging or correcting pieces to supplement his income. A harmless deception, perhaps, in his own eyes, restoring value to damaged antiques. But Edgar, discovering it, might have feared exposure or blackmail, or seen an opportunity. No. The will provided the true motive. The forgeries were secondary. That evening, Dr. Haydock telephoned with the results of the analysis. "The cloth you found definitely had cyanide residue," he said. "And those grains were potassium cyanide. Enough on the cloth alone to account for the dose that killed him. It looks as though the poison was applied directly to the polishing cloth Hargrove used that last morning, rather than mixed into the brightener bottle." Miss Marple thanked him quietly. So the method was clear. A cloth prepared in advance, substituted for the clean one Hargrove would normally have taken. Used once, then discarded in panic. The discarded cloth had been stained with polish, and with cyanide. It was the murderer's own cloth, brought in for the purpose. And who would have a spare polishing cloth to hand stained in exactly the right way? An apprentice, constantly at the bench. Miss Marple sat by her fire long into the evening, her knitting idle in her lap. The pieces were falling into place. Edgar had expected the business. He had learned, somehow, that the new will deprived him of ownership. He had access to the cyanide, knowledge of its effect, and the skill to introduce it undetectably into the familiar routine of polishing. The chalice with its hidden tools explained his recent cheerfulness, perhaps. Blackmail in reserve if the inheritance failed. But murder had seemed the surer path. Outside, a light frost silvered the garden, and the stars were sharp in a clear sky. Miss Marple rose at last, turned off the lamps, and went to bed. Tomorrow, she thought, would be time enough to speak to Inspector Slack. The net was closing gently but inexorably around the young man who had believed himself so clever. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Field. The revelation of Mr. Hargrove's will acted upon the village like a stone dropped into a still pond. Ripples of speculation spread outward, touching every cottage and shop. Edgar Lawson, who had carried himself with quiet confidence for weeks, now went about with hunched shoulders and a guarded expression. Villagers who had offered him sympathy now watched him with thoughtful eyes. Inspector Slack, informed of the will's terms by Mr. Pender, lost no time. He arrived at the workshop that very afternoon and questioned Edgar closely about when he had learned of the change. "I knew nothing of it," Edgar insisted, his voice tight. "He often talked of leaving the place to me. He'd said it for years. If he changed his mind, he never told me." Slack was unconvinced. Come now, lad. You worked beside him every day. You must have seen something. Letters to the solicitor, perhaps, or a draft of the new will. Edgar shook his head stubbornly. He kept his private papers locked in the desk upstairs. I never pried. But the inspector had already obtained permission to search the premises. In the small living room above the shop, he found, tucked behind a row of books on silversmithing, a folded sheet of paper in Mr. Hargrove's handwriting. A rough draft of the very instructions later embodied in the formal will. The date at the top was 6 weeks earlier. Slack confronted Edgar with it that evening. Care to explain how this came to be in your possession? Edgar paled. I found it after he died. I was tidying his things. I didn't know what it meant at first. Didn't you? It's perfectly clear. He was planning to sell the business over your head. You found this, realized you'd lose everything you'd worked for, and decided to act. Edgar protested vehemently, but the inspector took him to the station for further questioning. By nightfall, the village had settled upon Edgar as the murderer, and most considered the case closed. Miss Marple, however, was not so sure. She sat in her drawing room the next morning with the polishing cloth, now returned by Dr. Haydock, spread upon a newspaper on the table. The stains and faint odor remained unmistakable. She had also prevailed upon the doctor to examine the chalice from the workshop, which he had done discreetly. His report, delivered over a cup of tea in her cottage, was illuminating. The hidden compartment you noticed contained tools for altering hallmarks, certainly. But they show very little sign of use, merely a few old scratches. I'd say Hargrove kept them as curiosities, or perhaps from his younger days when standards were less rigid. There's no evidence he was actively forging pieces recently. Miss Marple nodded. So the forgery quarrel with Captain Blaine was genuine enough on Hargrove's side, but the tools were not the secret Edgar feared. Exactly. And there's more. I tested the current brightener in the bottle. Perfectly harmless. But the saucer beneath where the chalice stood still held traces of the poisoned mixture. Someone prepared a small amount specially, used it with the cloth, and then cleaned up carefully. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The cloth I found was the one actually used that morning. The murderer brought it in, substituted it for Hargrove's clean one, knowing he would polish alone before opening the shop. Afterwards, in the confusion, it was thrown away. Haydock leaned forward. And that points directly to Edgar. He had a duplicate key to the back door. He admitted as much when Slack questioned him. He could have come in the previous evening, prepared the cloth, and left it ready. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. It seems so, does it not? And yet... She rose and went to the window, gazing out at the frosty garden. There is one small thing that troubles me. The time of death. Dr. Haydock, you placed it between 8 and 10, but more precisely? I'd say closer to 9. The body was still slightly warm when I arrived just after 11, and rigor was only beginning. And Edgar's alibi? Mrs. Bantry's cook confirms he arrived at Gossington Hall at 9:30, stayed for tea, and left about 10:15. Tommy Pierce found the body shortly before 11. Miss Marple turned back to him. So if death occurred around 9, Edgar could have poisoned the cloth earlier, say the night before, knowing Hargrove's invariable habit of polishing the commissioned piece first thing each morning. Precisely. The old man would have used the prepared cloth without suspicion, inhaled or absorbed enough cyanide during the process, and collapsed within minutes. Miss Marple returned to her chair. It fits. And yet there is the matter of the unlocked cupboard. If the poison was not taken from the brightener bottle, why leave the cupboard open? Haydock shrugged. Panic, perhaps, or to suggest that Hargrove himself had been careless. Or, Miss Marple said softly, to cast suspicion on someone who might have taken the key temporarily. She was silent for a moment, then resumed her knitting with renewed purpose. That afternoon she paid a final visit to the workshop. Edgar had been released for the time being. There was evidence, but not yet enough for an arrest. He was at the bench, listlessly polishing a spoon. Miss Marple entered quietly. "Good afternoon, Edgar. I'm glad to see you here. It would be a pity if the shop closed permanently." He looked up, his face drawn. "They'll arrest me soon enough, miss. Everyone thinks I did it." Miss Marple studied the workbench. The chalice was back in its place, gleaming innocently. "You had a duplicate key to the back door, I believe." "Yes, for deliveries when master was out." "And the cupboard key?" He hesitated. "There was only one. He kept it on his ring." Miss Marple nodded. "So no one else could have taken cyanide from the bottle without forcing the lock, which was not forced." Edgar met her gaze steadily. "That's right, miss." She thanked him and left, her mind made up. That evening she telephoned Inspector Slack and asked him to come to her cottage the following morning. "I believe I can clarify certain points," she said mildly. Slack arrived promptly at 10, notebook in hand, looking skeptical but polite. Miss Marple offered him a cup of coffee and a slice of seed cake, which he accepted with gruff thanks. "Now, Inspector," she began, settling into her chair, "this has been a puzzling case, but the solution is really quite simple once one discards the red herrings." Slack grunted. "We've got the lad dead to rights. Motive with the will, opportunity with the key, knowledge of the poison." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. Edgar did not do it." Slack stared. "But the evidence is almost all circumstantial and much of it planted. The draft will found upstairs, conveniently placed where you would find it. The unlocked cupboard. The poisoned cloth discarded where it would eventually be discovered." She paused. "No, the murderer wished us to suspect Edgar, and the only person who stood to gain from his conviction was the one who actually inherited under the old arrangement everyone believed in. Until the new will surfaced." Slack frowned. "You mean Miss Prentice?" "Exactly. She quarreled with her uncle over money. She knew he kept a special brightener with cyanide, perhaps from watching him work on previous visits. During her secret return on the yacht, Wednesday evening, she let herself in with a key she had taken earlier and duplicated in London. She is a resourceful woman. She prepared the cloth, left it ready, and returned to town. Then, when the new will was read and Edgar seemed the obvious suspect, she felt safe. But she overlooked small things. The precise timing, the unused forging tools that offered no real motive for Edgar, and the fact that the poison was not from the bottle at all. Slack leaned forward. "But the will leaves her only the jewelry, which is worth a considerable sum, far more than she admitted needing, and with Edgar convicted, the new will might have been challenged successfully on grounds of undue influence or confusion. But the true motive was to prevent the business being sold away from the family altogether." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I suggest you examine Miss Prentice's gloves, the pair she wore on her visits. I believe you will find faint traces of polish and cyanide on the inside." She handled the cloth carefully, but not carefully enough. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "Well, Miss Marple, if you're right, I'll have her brought in for questioning at once." He rose, shaking his head in reluctant admiration. "You've a rare knack for this sort of thing." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "One merely observes human nature, Inspector. It is always the same." As he left, she returned to her knitting, the needles clicking peacefully in the quiet room. The field had narrowed at last, and the truth stood clear. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The drawing room at the vicarage was the obvious choice for the gathering. It was spacious, comfortably furnished with worn but respectable armchairs and a good fire, and, most importantly, the vicar's wife was away visiting her sister in Much Benham for the day. Miss Marple had suggested the venue to Inspector Slack with her usual gentle firmness, and he had agreed at once. By 3 o'clock on a cold, clear afternoon, the room held an unusual assembly. Inspector Slack stood near the fireplace, solid and official, with Constable Polk beside him looking important. Captain Blaine sat stiffly upright in a high-backed chair, his military mustache bristling with lingering indignation. Mrs. Lydia Dane perched on the edge of a seat, twisting a handkerchief in her worn hands. Edgar Lawson leaned against the window frame, pale but composed. Evelyn Prentice occupied a central sofa, immaculately dressed in a charcoal coat and skirt, her sharp features composed into an expression of polite boredom. Miss Marple herself sat quietly in a corner chair, her hands folded over her handbag, looking for all the world like a mild old lady who had dropped in for a cup of tea. When everyone was settled, Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming. Miss Marple has asked me to assemble you all because she believes she can throw light on Mr. Hargrove's death. I'll let her explain." All eyes turned to the elderly figure in the corner. Miss Marple gave a small apologetic smile. "Thank you, Inspector. I do dislike making a fuss, but certain things have become clear, and it is best that everything is understood. This began, as so many tragedies do, with money, or rather the lack of it. Mr. Hargrove was not a rich man, but he had a comfortable competence and a valuable business. Several people depended upon him in one way or another, and several were disappointed. We thought at first it was heart failure. Then we learned it was cyanide poisoning, subtle, quick, and leaving that characteristic almond odor. The poison was introduced not into the brightener bottle, but onto a polishing cloth that Mr. Hargrove used alone on the morning of his death. Now the murderer needed 3 things: knowledge of Mr. Hargrove's habits, access to cyanide, and the opportunity to prepare that cloth without being observed. She paused, her calm blue eyes moving gently around the room. "Edgar, you seemed the obvious suspect. You knew the craft intimately. You expected to inherit the business, and when we discovered the new will, leaving the workshop to a London firm, you appeared to have the strongest possible motive. The draft found upstairs, the unlocked cupboard, even the discarded cloth, all pointed to you. But they pointed a little too neatly, don't you think? Almost as though someone wished us to notice them." Edgar straightened, surprise flickering across his face. Miss Marple continued softly. "The truth is simpler and rather sadder. Miss Prentice, you have been clever, very clever indeed. But you overlooked the small things that matter so much. You quarreled with your uncle over money he had lent you long ago. You needed more, and he refused. During your visit, you learned about his special brightener. Perhaps he showed it to you proudly, explaining its dangers. You took an impression of the back door key, had a duplicate made in London, and returned secretly on the Wednesday evening. That night you let yourself in, prepared a polishing cloth with cyanide from the cupboard, leaving the door unlocked to suggest carelessness or implicate someone else, and placed the cloth where your uncle would use it first thing Friday morning. You returned to London on the late train, secure in your alibi. You believed the old will, the one everyone knew about, would stand, leaving the business to Edgar and a substantial legacy to yourself. But when the new will was read, everything changed. Edgar now had motive, and suspicion fell on him at once. You felt safe. Evelyn Prentice had gone very still. Her face remained composed, but her gloved hands were clasped tightly in her lap. You almost succeeded, Miss Marple went on. But there were mistakes. The poison was not taken from the brightener bottle at all. The residue was only on the cloth. The forging tools in the chalice were old, and unused, offering no real motive for Edgar. And the draft of the will, so conveniently discovered, was placed just where the police would find it. But the clearest evidence is on your gloves, Miss Prentice, the pair you wore during your visits. Traces of silver polish and cyanide remain inside the lining where your fingers touched the prepared cloth. Inspector Slack stepped forward. We have those gloves now, miss. Obtained from your room at the Blue Boar with the landlord's permission. The laboratory confirmed the residues this morning. Evelyn Prentice looked at him for a long moment. Then the composure cracked. Her face twisted with sudden bitterness. He was an old miser, she said harshly. He had plenty and wouldn't help me when I was desperate. I only took what should have been mine anyway. She rose abruptly, but Constable Polk was already at her side. The arrest was quiet and dignified. There was no struggle. As she was led away, Captain Blaine cleared his throat gruffly. Well, I'll be dashed. Never would have thought it. Mrs. Dane began to cry softly with relief. Edgar remained by the window, staring out at the wintry garden as though he could not quite believe his ordeal was over. When the room had emptied, save for Miss Marple and the inspector, Slack shook his head in admiration. How did you know it was her, miss? Not the lad? Miss Marple picked up her handbag and umbrella. Because Edgar is ambitious, Inspector, but not cruel, and because the clues that damned him were just a little too obvious. Murderers who plant evidence often overdo it. They cannot resist making assurance doubly sure. Besides, she added with a tiny smile, I have known several nieces in my time. Family feeling is a wonderful thing, but when it is mixed with greed, well, one learns to be wary. Slack chuckled. You'll have to write a book one day, Miss Marple. She shook her head gently. Oh no, Inspector, I only observe. The stories tell themselves. She left him standing by the fire and walked home through the crisp afternoon, her steps light despite the cold. The village lay peaceful around her, the mystery resolved, justice done, and in St. Mary Mead, life could return to its pleasant, unhurried rhythm. Chapter 10. Resolution over tea. A fortnight after the dramatic scene at the vicarage, St. Mary Mead had slipped back into its familiar winter quiet. Frost silvered the hedgerows each morning. The church bell rang clear across the frozen fields for early service, and the shops began to display modest Christmas wares, holly wreaths, boxes of candied fruit, and the first tentative strings of colored lights. The workshop on the High Street reopened under Edgar Lawson's management. The London firm, having inherited the business, proved surprisingly amenable. They were content to leave day-to-day affairs in the hands of the young man who knew it best, provided accounts were rendered quarterly. Edgar, pale still but steadier, worked long hours restoring the stock and accepting commissions. The villagers, feeling collectively guilty for having suspected him, brought him small repairs and gifts of cake. Evelyn Prentice's arrest had caused a 9 days' wonder, but village gossip, though rich, is also mercifully short-lived. By mid-December, her name was mentioned less often, and then only with a shake of the head and a murmured, "Poor Mr. Hargrove, such a wicked thing." On a bright afternoon just before Christmas, Miss Marple invited a small party to tea in her cozy drawing room. The fire burned cheerfully, the kettle sang on its spirit lamp, and the table was laid with her best lace cloth, thin bread and butter, scones still warm from the oven, and a rich fruit cake dark with cherries and almonds. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, bundled in furs and full of news from Gossington Hall. Dr. Haydock followed, stamping snow from his boots and declaring that the fresh air had never tasted better. The vicar came next, beaming benevolently, and finally Edgar Lawson, a little hesitant on the threshold until Miss Marple welcomed him with genuine warmth. "Do come in, Edgar. We are all so pleased to see the workshop open again." He took the proffered chair near the fire, color rising in his cheeks. It's kind of you, Miss Marple. After everything, I wasn't sure anyone would want me there. Nonsense, Mrs. Bantry said robustly, accepting a generous slice of cake. You were the one person who truly understood the business, and now it's yours to run properly. Dr. Haydock nodded. Justice has been done thanks to Miss Marple here, though I confess I never suspected the niece. Miss Marple poured tea with careful precision, milk first as was proper, and handed round cups. One does not like to suspect anyone, Doctor, but when the small things do not quite fit, the unlocked cupboard, the conveniently placed draft of the will, the cloth discarded just where it would be found, one is forced to consider possibilities. The vicar stirred his tea thoughtfully. A sad case of greed overcoming natural affection. Yet I am glad the truth came out before an innocent young man suffered. Edgar looked down at his plate. I shall always be grateful, miss. If you hadn't spoken up, Miss Marple smiled gently. You would have been cleared in time, I am sure. But time is precious and injustice weighs heavily. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Tell me, Jane, how did you know it was the gloves? That was brilliant. A small thing, Miss Marple said modestly. Miss Prentice was always elegantly gloved, even indoors. When preparing the cloth, she would naturally keep them on to avoid stains on her hands. But the inside of the gloves would touch the poisoned surface. Cyanide residues linger. It was a risk she overlooked. Dr. Haydock chuckled. And the rest of us overlooked the obvious. We were so busy chasing Edgar's supposed motive that we forgot the older, simpler one, family indebtedness. The conversation turned to lighter matters, the arrangements for the carol service, the bazaar's successful takings, the prospect of snow for Christmas. Edgar gradually relaxed, accepting a second scone and even venturing a shy opinion on the best way to polish silver without harsh chemicals. As the afternoon light began to fade and the guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple accompanied Edgar to the door. You will do well, Edgar, she said quietly. Your master taught you honestly in the craft, if not always in other matters. Keep to the honest path and the business will prosper. He met her eyes earnestly. I will, miss, and I'll make sure his name is remembered properly. When the door closed behind the last visitor, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room. The fire had settled into a comfortable glow and the room smelled pleasantly of tea and cake. She gathered the cups onto a tray, then sat for a moment in her favorite chair, looking out at the wintry garden. Human nature, she reflected, was indeed always the same, capable of great kindness and great cruelty often within the same heart. Greed had led Evelyn Prentice astray, just as ambition had nearly undone Edgar, and fear had troubled poor Mrs. Dane. Yet kindness had prevailed in the end. The London firm's generosity, the village's quiet support, the gentle unraveling of truth. Outside, the church clock struck 4, its notes floating clear and peaceful across the frosted roofs. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, a soft Shetland shawl in pale blue, and resumed her even stitches. Another little drama had played itself out in St. Mary Mead. Life would go on, serene on the surface, intricate beneath, and she, with her mild eyes and patient observation, would be ready for whatever small mystery might come next. For in villages, as in the wider world, there was always something quietly brewing behind the net curtains.